An original
from Story Studio Network.
I'm Dave Trafford, and this is the 2030 Project. The 2030 Project is a Story Studio Network podcast sponsored by Daily Bread Food Bank, a Toronto-based charity whose mission is to collaborate with all to eliminate food insecurity and advocate for solutions to end poverty. After 3 years of consultations, legislative crafting, committee reviews, and political pushing and pulling in the House of Commons and in the Senate in Ottawa, the Canada Disability Benefit Act finally received royal assent on June the 21st, 2023. It's intended to raise those living with disabilities in Canada out of poverty. Can it? Will it? In this episode of the 2030 Project, we meet the woman now who holds the pen on this file. It's her responsibility to get the Canada Disability Benefit across the finish line.
Hello, I am Kamal Khera, a proud Member of Parliament for a beautiful riding of Brampton West and Canada's Minister of Diversity, Inclusion and Persons with Disabilities.
You know, when that job landed on your desk, I guess that was back in July. Does that sound about right? It was a bit of a blur, right? I think what was interesting is that, to me, I view this as hopeful for, particularly for those who were depending on the Canada Disability Benefit, because the portfolio you have been given was sort of standalone to deal specifically with this and other issues around disabilities and inclusion. And, you know, previously, it's not that the previous minister had, you know, sort of misguided that, because she was the one who really pulled this across the finish line back in June. But I thought it was an interesting, subtle signal from the government that this was, and this is, a priority. So there's some hope there. What do you think is the biggest challenge, though, right now for you on the disability benefit?
Absolutely. Well, look, thank you so much for this conversation. Let me just start by, recognizing that during the last parliamentary session, we achieved a great milestone by successfully passing the Canada Disability Framework legislation. And I think I do want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank the disability community, the advocates, persons with disabilities themselves, for their relentless work and advocacy for decades, actually, for achieving this generational milestone. And I call it a generational milestone because this is something that we're going to be talking about for a long, long time in Canada. And I can tell you my top priority within this new role, and I'm super excited, and it's an honor and a privilege to be able to do this extremely important work, is to make sure that we're strengthening the financial security for those most vulnerable, and that we're removing barriers for them to be included and engaged in their community. And, it really is about accessibility. It really is about, building that inclusive, accessible, and barrier-free Canada. And, there's not a single silver bullet that we can do to achieve that, right? Like, it has to be addressed on a number of fronts. And, my predecessor, Carla Qualtrough, who's done tremendous amount of work to get to where we are today. But if you recall, back in 2019, when we put forward, Canada's Accessible Canada Act, that act in itself led to, the first ever disability inclusion action plan last year. That in itself is a roadmap to lead to a barrier-free Canada with a human rights approach that has an intersectionality in it, composed in it, and has four major pillars. And I think it's important to get that frame right, because, people just saying, okay, the disability benefits the only thing that we're doing. Like, there's a couple of things. But if you look at that big framework of the Disability Inclusion Action Plan, it has 4 big pillars. First is around strengthening financial security for persons with disabilities. And that's exactly where the Canada Disability comes in. And I think that in itself isn't the only thing, because we're truly building a safe social safety net. And, we've done that with Canada Child Benefit, on the disability side, with the GIS, with the CPP, the CPPD, the workers benefit. The second big piece is, of course, also around employment. How do we remove barriers? How do we support employers and individuals themselves, tapping into that untapped potential? The third big pillar is around accessible, inclusive community. And fourth is around actually having that modern approach to disabilities. And I say this because, I think it's important to also get that frame right. Like, we're going to be able to do this. This is really about building that inclusive Canada, accessible Canada. And the fact that we delivered the Canada disability legislation in the last parliamentary session, I think it's historic. Now that it is law, my big priority, and you talked about, now this, I'm going to answer your question, is around what is my biggest challenge. And I wouldn't say a challenge, but I think it really is an opportunity where my biggest priority is actually getting this benefit out of the door as quickly as possible, but also getting it right by working and engaging with the community to make sure not only do we get it right, it is in the true spirit of nothing without us. Because, we all know the stats. I know you've done a lot of research on this as well. 23% of working age persons with disabilities live in poverty, which is twice the rate of other Canadians. 52% of persons with disabilities have, income from social assistance. And I think it's really important that members of the community, stakeholders, participate in some of the roundtables and the work that I've been doing in consulting with Canadians. That is going to be a comprehensive, meaningful consultation that we're doing in coming up with regulations. So I wouldn't necessarily say a challenge, perhaps, but this is a really great opportunity to ensure that we're doing this work with the community. And as you know, I think there are very diverse voices. I think it's really important to apply that intersectional lens to disabilities. But I think it really is about listening to the community so that we can get this right quickly as possible, but we also have to get it right.
Okay, there's a lot in there we want to unpack. Okay, and I'm glad you kind of laid the framework there, the foundation for the conversation. Let's start with the consultation. Much has been said that nothing about us without us kind of feel to this whole approach, and yeah. This is innovative in many respects in terms of how legislation like this is being developed. But the idea of it being co-designed, I think we're stumbling over expectations here. And there's perhaps some definition, because I'm getting a sense from those whom I have already spoken to in this series that there is an expectation that it's not just about consulting with them, that they are actually going to have hands-on effect in terms of the outcome vis-a-vis the regulations. And there already seems to be more of a sense that this is more of a traditional approach to consultation, that it's not as much as heavily relying on this co-design process. It already sounds like at that stage, I get it, it might slow things down, but that's critical. So how do we ensure that the co-design, nothing about us without us motto really is at the heart of what we're going to end up with when we have these regulations?
Absolutely. And I think that goes back to exactly what I talked about, opportunities. And, it's been July. I guess it's been now a couple of weeks in this role, and the amount of feedback that I'm hearing from the community with stakeholders themselves, and many of the stakeholders that I know you've been engaging with, they are part of our ministerial disability advisory group, who are very much part of also telling us what the community is saying, that we're really doing this work in true spirit of nothing without us. And that meaningful consultation to me is, I'll share with you. I think really applying that intersectional lens is so important. I just actually this week had a wonderful roundtable with um, uh, women with disabilities and with lived experiences. I heard from Jolene. And I'll share this because she said, I asked her if I can share your story with her. She's a mother of twins with intellectual disability, and she really talked about the real challenges she's having right now, just putting food on the table. Like, it is really important to look at that. When you add in aspects of women in rural Canada, what this benefit will mean for people that actually don't have supports right now currently with depending on where they live. I think applying that intersectional lens, ensuring that I hear from members of the community, and as I mentioned, and as you may know, it is a very diverse community with persons with disabilities, and there are so many different intersectionalities with where they are, what their real challenges are, what their lived experiences are like, and it's really important that I hear that. So I've already started this consultation. Obviously there's departmental consultations that are happening, but I myself have started engaging with the community on this as well.
But Minister, but engaging with the community is one thing. But let's go back to the co-design notion of this, because I think that there's a sense in the co-design approach or the process that was spoken about that there was more of an active role as opposed to a consultative role for stakeholders.
Well, I think we can only do that when we actually hear the community. And I think that's really important, to really meaningfully consulting with them as they work towards designing and implementing this process, right? Like, you can't do that unless I hear from them, unless we're hearing from all the diverse voices. And it's not, as I mentioned, it's not, it's a very diverse community. It is that intersectionality of those individuals are very unique. Their challenges are very unique, and they all need to be part of that, and I think there's going to be immense opportunity for the community, for me, for my department to really be part of this. We're also going to be, so there's going to be many roundtables that we're putting out there. We're doing a lot more outreach and engagement that is planned for, important aspects such as the cost of disability, on what the administrative process should look like, making sure what the appeal process will look like. This is the things that we need to make sure that there's a barrier-free application process. These are things that we're going to need to feed into what the community wants. And to your point, and I have this conversation with so many stakeholders, but persons with disabilities themselves, there are very diverse voices and what people want. And I think it's important that we listen to every single one of those voices. There's also going to be a launch on an online survey, a portal for open submissions to gather input as we're drafting these regulations, because as I mentioned, like, this is not, we want to make sure community, when this benefit comes out, this is a benefit that they want, and this is a benefit that they've created. There's a lot of
just
work
to be
there,
clear,
also,
that it's a benefit that they need. I mean, let's start there. We're talking about poverty, and poverty is an abject need. So that's one thing. But the whole idea, and I get the effort to say we want to make it accessible, and so we're going to have a portal. I've talked to a lot of folks in the disability community. He says, I don't even have a computer. I don't have access to the internet. So this is what I mean by, it being able to put it out there. We want to do it quickly, but at the same time, we've got this diverse group. So there are real challenges there with the timelines. And I don't want to dwell on this too long, but I just want to make it clear. If we get to this whole question of co-design, how is this process then? Let me ask it this way. How is this process different in terms of developing these regulations and the framework, filling out the framework? How is this one different than a more typical or a traditional approach to consultation?
Well, I think the work that we're doing, and you can't just, it's not a, here's a challenge that I mentioned to you, right? Like, I hear from community, they need, as to your point, they need this benefit now. If not now, they needed it yesterday, right?
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Yeah.
That
No
is just
question.
the reality. That is
Yep.
just the reality. But at the same time, as this the work we're doing with the community, with stakeholders, with experts, with persons with disabilities, they need to be part of that design. They need to be part of that work that we're doing. So, and that work can't happen unless we hear from them, unless I personally have those conversations and look at those, again, to your point, like it's a diverse group. There's not it's not like like a silver bullet, and this is, I'm going to do
Sure.
X, Y, and Z, and the
This is not a
community will.
monolithic community. I get it.
Absolutely,
Right.
absolutely. And
Yep.
I think we're doing a lot of engagement on my personal part. I'm doing a lot of engagement. I'm making it a priority for me and my team to listen to those voices, not just the stakeholders, which are great, and I have many of them, but listening to the lived experiences of many. So we're not only holding many consultations, but there's going to be immense opportunity for community to really feel like they are part of the process, because they need to be part of the process.
So
So
let's go
that
back
is
to.
a priority. So that is a priority for me.
Yep.
And I'll make sure, and as we kind of move this forward, that we're making myself available to the community as well, so I hear directly
Sure, and
from them.
I appreciate the fact that I'm asking you a question while you're building the plane in flight. I get it.
Absolutely.
But it's an important part of it, because you did say off the top, we want to make sure we do this correctly. We want to get it
Absolutely.
right. And what I've learned from exploring this is that the regulatory process is probably better for the outcome, because it's almost a living thing. Then it's organic. If there are different needs that come up, it's not set in stone. We can actually reflect and pivot and so on. So I think that's an important part of that. So
Absolutely.
But here, let me ask you this. Each of these things is going to have to be regulated at a provincial level. This will be a national program, but regulated provincially. And again, I like to think I'm paying attention. In the course of this discussion, I found out that, being disabled in Alberta is not the same thing as being disabled in Halifax or in Toronto. So there are different definitions all of a sudden of disability. There's a different criteria provincial, territorially across the country.
Absolutely.
How do you get at that so that, if my mom is living in Ontario with a disability and she moves to visit her brother in Alberta, all of a sudden she's not losing any kind of benefit. You get what I'm getting at. The definition
Absolutely.
of disability becomes core to it, and it's easy to overlook.
Absolutely. And I think to your point around, and I was going to get to this, and I'm grateful that you got to this, because we are, as you mentioned, we're building a plane as we're flying it, and that is a correct analogy as we're doing this work. And I think the work that we're doing with our PT counterparts is absolutely crucial. My biggest priorities also to make sure everyone that receives the Canada Disability Benefit is actually better off. It is not income replacement, it is an income supplement. So that work is, we are already starting to have these conversations with our provincial, territorial counterparts. There are over 6 million Canadians who self-identify as having a disability, who, particularly those of our working age, and as we know, are at much higher risk of poverty than Canadians without disabilities. So we want to make sure that we work closely with provinces and territories to ensure this supplement does not result in any undue, clawbacks or unintended consequences. That is my number one priority with my provincial counterparts that I'm already having those discussions with. So we're going to make sure it's designed to take into all those considerations, all those sources of income, including existing, federal benefits, but also provincial, territorial level supports, working income, and other benefits. So this fall is my big priority, is actually having those conversations with my PT counterparts. Some of that work is already started, but we want to make sure that Canadians with disabilities in Canada are better off with this Canada Disability Benefit, and that it is an income supplement and not an income replacement from the other benefits that they may be getting and depending on where they're living.
Yeah, and I talked to, as I mentioned, to Senator Petitclerc about this
Yes.
very thing, and the Senate was very specific in, putting in front of the House amendments that said we can't have clawbacks, but the House did not adopt that amendment. So I'm hearing from folks who are watching this closely and the legal side of things saying you've baked in a loophole here. You're going to allow maybe not the provinces, but private insurance companies to use that as a clawback mechanism. How do we get around that? I mean, that's a big sticking point. I heard it from all of the folks with lived experience and advocacy groups that the clawback is really at the heart of making sure that this is done right.
Absolutely. And I can tell you that is my one of the big challenges that we're going to have to work to make sure that doesn't happen. And I want to assure, particularly, persons with disabilities that are maybe listening to this podcast right now, that my big priority is making sure that, and it is going to ensure that the benefit that you receive, that you are better off. And it's not.
So how do we do that? How do you get at that to make sure that, financial institution A is not clawing back benefit because all of a sudden now I have this supplement from the federal government?
Well, those are the conversations that I mentioned that we're having right now as we speak with all different levels of governments, but also with some of the private insurance that you're talking about. Like, this is exactly the type of work that's why, when people say, why can't we get the benefit right now, or why couldn't we get it yesterday? Because of exactly the type of things that you're talking about, and we make sure when we get to a point we get it right.
So what's the tone of those conversations? What does that sounding like in terms of your own view of that, specifically with, I think the provinces are probably an easier nut. Now maybe I'm stepping out on something, but I think the private sector is a bit of a sort of a variable here that is harder to nail down. So what's your sense of those conversations with private sector insurance?
Well, as I mentioned, like, these conversations are ongoing, but I want to assure Canadians with disabilities that I will do everything in my power to ensure that people that receive benefit are better off.
The other part of this is timeline. And I think you rightly point out this is not a matter of, hoping that we get it. People needed it months ago, and they're all cheering that they finally have this framework legislation. But, what took so long? One of the things that interrupted it was an election call. So the legislation had to be reintroduced. We're 18 months away from a likely election. What is the commitment to make sure this gets passed before the Prime Minister decides? And I know you have no insight into when the Prime Minister might call an election, but it only adds urgency to this, because let me play out the role. Another party, or all of a sudden you are faced with having to deal with this in the next Parliament, whether you're in government or not, it just slows things down. So the pending possibility of an election with a minority government certainly adds more fire to the urgency around this. Is that playing into this timeline?
Well, look, I mean, I can't predict the future. I wish we all could. That would be great. But I think when you talk about the timelines for this benefit, we're on track. As you know, we passed the Canada Disability Benefit into law in June. We announced the plan on the next steps to the design of the regulation while truly upholding the spirit of Nothing Without Us in July. The plan detailed on the next phase of the design of the benefit and those draft regulations. They're in all of those timelines are actually unchanged, and we remain on schedule. In parallel, as I mentioned, we're working and having these discussions with provinces and territories and others to ensure that everyone that receives this benefit is better off. I know, as I mentioned, I know Canadians with disabilities want to see this benefit become a reality as soon as possible, and I can assure you that is my top priority. And once these consultations are done this fall, we will have the first draft of the the regulations shortly after. I mean, this really is a generational opportunities to implement a national program. And I think we need that balanced approach of, as you talked about the two parallel challenges I have, right? Like to get it out as quickly as possible, but we also need to make sure we get it right. So I think it's about that balanced approach of continuing to consult on the benefit while also moving forward with the creation of the framework and the policies associated with the national program of the size and scope. So that's exactly what we're committed to do. I can tell you, I want to make sure that this becomes a reality as quickly as possible, but something that the community wants.
Well, when you say you're on schedule, what does that? Is there a pin that we can put in the calendar and say this will be completed and checks will be out the door by this date?
Well, as I mentioned, right, like there are parallel things and happening at the same time, like with PTs, with the work that's happening right now. But in terms of the regulatory process, the terms of the work that we're doing, I mean, a regulatory process takes generally like 12 months, and that's what we're on par with. At the same time, we're having conversations, obviously with finance and others to make sure we can get it out the door as quickly as possible. The PT work, and we talked about this, that is a PT, provincial territorial work that we're doing, so folks are actually better off. I mean, these are all very important considerations and discussions that we're having, and the fact that this needs to be doing and developing these regulations while upholding the true spirit of nothing without us, like these are very important considerations. These are very important work that we're doing with the community, with our provincial territorial counterparts, with all members of the community. So when I say we're on track, I think we're exactly following, like there hasn't been nothing has been off track in terms of ever since this benefit came into effect, and we're going to make sure we get it right.
So is it fair to say a year from now, we'll have a really good sense of what all of this looks like? There will be a schedule in place for the disabled in this country to be receiving a supplement check of some form from the federal government.
I am very hopeful. Again, I wish I can predict the future. I wish we all can.
I get it. I get it.
But I'm very hopeful in terms of the work that that's taking place as we speak with as I mentioned, with the community, with my department, with PTs and others to make sure that we're going to get this right. I'm really excited. I mean, this is a once in a generational benefit, and it's because of the advocacy of the community, their relentless advocacy of the community, and I think it adds into and ensures that whole social safety net that I know we've been building on with the Canada Child Benefit, with the Guaranteed Income Supplement, with increasing to the old age security, with the workers benefit. Like it really is a building another I don't want to say bullet, but like another pillar to creating that social safety net for Canadians, which I know is so important, particularly to ensure that we're lifting people out of poverty. And there's immense amount of work that we've done, but there's so much more work that we have to do.
Well, and to your credit, I mean, I think that those programs have proven that, in fact, they have worked to lift and raise people out of poverty. And here is the hope. And, I started off by asking what your biggest challenge is. And I don't necessarily need you to comment on this, but I'm thinking that the biggest challenge you may face right now is time, and that's because you're trying to stick handle good policy against the backdrop of parliamentary politics. I still think that the whole question of a looming election scares people a little in terms of how this is actually going to get executed. We don't want it to be stalled as a result of that. But listen, thanks for your time, your passion, your commitment to explaining, and certainly it's good of you to put yourself up front here and answer the questions. Needless to say, we'll be watching closely, and we may be back in your inbox to follow up and see how things are going. Thank you.
Absolutely. No, thank you for your time. And I again want to say thank you for the series that you're doing. I think it's extremely important work. And I know many Canadians, particularly Canadians with disabilities, have been really paying close attention. And I would love to come back and make sure that you and the members that are listening, the viewers that you have, are able to know the work that is going ahead and the work that we're going to get to in making this a reality. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome. And I think as I go through this, and just to close, it's one of those things where I'm beginning to realize that this is something that flies under the radar for most Canadians. But when they realize the need, they realize the challenges that the disabled communities have right across the country, they're outraged by the fact that we have let it get to this point. So that there is progress here, I think, is promising, to say the least. Minister, thank you.
Thank you so much.
The 2030 Project is a Story Studio Network podcast that we are proud to produce. It is sponsored by Daily Bread Food Bank. If you'd like to help eliminate poverty, start by sharing this podcast with your federal MP, your member of provincial parliament, your local municipal representatives, anyone you think needs to hear this message about the Canada Disability Benefit. And to learn more, visit dailybread.ca. Mike Trutler is our technical producer and audio editor here at Story Studio Network, and the 2030 Project is produced by the team at Daily Bread Food Bank. I'm Dave Trafford. Thanks for listening.